In the stillness of rural Bavaria, nestled among the forests and fields, lies the haunting legacy of one of Germany's most peculiar unsolved crimes, the Hinterkaifeck Murders. In late March or early April of 1922, 6 inhabitants of an isolated farmstead were brutally slain under circumstances so strange and unsettling that the case has fascinated detectives, historians, and true crime enthusiasts for over a century. This is a story woven with whispers, suspicious footprints, and the enduring mystery of a crime that has never been solved. Hinterkaifeck was a rather small, remote farmstead located about 70 kilometers north of Munich, near the Bavarian town of Grobern. The German word for behind is Hinter, and as the property was indeed behind Kaifeck, the unofficial name of Hinterkaifeck came to be. The property was surrounded by thick woods and stood alone, separated from its nearest neighbours by a stretch of fields and frozen silence. The inhabitants of the farm were Andreas Gruber, aged 63, his wife Cecilia, 72, their widowed daughter Victoria Gabriel, 35, and Victoria's children Cecilia, 7, and Joseph, 2, as well as the family's new maid, Maria Baumgartner. The life of the Hinterkaifeck family was defined by social isolation, secrecy, and tension. Much of the dark and difficult family dynamic was centered on the tyrannical patriarch Andreas Gruber, who controlled the family with a gruff demeanor and was allegedly violent with both the children and his wife. He was no more kinder to those outside of the family, and it was often left to his wife Cecilia to mediate disputes between him and their neighbours. Victoria, Andreas and Cecilia's daughter, also lived a rather reserved lifestyle, though she was known to be a talented singer at the local choir. She had, supposedly, lost her husband in the First World War in the year 1914. Curiously, her second child, Joseph, was born in 1919. It is of course possible that Joseph's father could have been a temporary lover of Victoria's, but some have suggested that he may have in fact been the result of an incestuous relationship between Victoria and her father, Andreas. This sort of talk gained traction long before the birth of Joseph, however, as in 1914, again the year Victoria's husband apparently passed, both Andreas and Victoria were in fact convicted and made to serve time in prison for incest. 1 year for Andreas and 1 month for Victoria. In the months leading up to the murders, the occupants of the Hinterkaifeck were made to endure numerous strange events that, in hindsight, could be seen as ominous foreshadowing for what was to occur. The father, Andreas Gruber, spoke of discovering footprints in the snow that led from the forest to the farm, but none that led back. A set of house keys went missing, and footsteps were heard in the attic at night. Upon checking the attic, however, Mr. Gruber found that nobody was there. Later, a newspaper appeared on the farm that none of the Grubers had purchased, and tools vanished only to reappear in odd places. All things that could, of course, be explained rationally in isolation, but still, together, proved rather frightening. So much so, in fact, that upon her resignation, the old housekeeper cited her reason for doing so as the house being haunted. In spite of these unsettling incidents, the Gruber family remained at Hinterkaifeck. Whether motivated by stubbornness or a sense of duty, they continued on with their routines, never suspecting the horror soon to come. The new maid, Maria Baumgartner, arrived at the family's farm on the ill-fated day of March the 31st, 1922, dropped off by her sister, likely the last person to have seen the family and their new maid alive. In the days following, a couple of locals had stopped by the Hinterkaifeck farm, but did not at that early stage find it overly suspicious that the family did not answer. They had a reputation for keeping to themselves after all. But then, more days passed. Mail continued to pile up. Alarmingly also, young Cecilia Gabriel had failed to show up for school, with no words from her parents as to why. and the family as a whole, who would normally be found at the church every Sunday, had failed to show up for worship. Eventually, word began to spread and concern began to grow among the community. Thus, according to reports, on April the 4th, a neighbour of the Grubers by the name of Lawrence Schlittenbauer arrived at the property along with two other men to look for the family. They, like previous visitors, found the farm eerily quiet and seemingly devoid of life. This latter suspicion would ultimately be confirmed when the men came to the stable to discover 4 lifeless bodies in the hay. It didn't take the men long to realise the bodies were that of Andreas Gruber, his wife Cecilia, his daughter Victoria Gabriel, and the 7-year-old Cecilia Gabriel. As if that wasn't gruesome enough a sight to see, when they ventured inside of the house, they sadly found the bodies of Maria Baumgartner and the family's youngest member, 2-year-old Joseph. Following an investigation, it was determined that an unknown person, or perhaps multiple people, had ended the lives of the 6 members of the Gruber household. The 4 that were found outside were all lured to the bar, and once inside were slaughtered with the use of a pickaxe. The family maid Maria and young Joseph met their end inside the home, in their own bedchambers. Disturbingly, it was also found that the accused had resided at the home of his victims, sleeping in their beds, eating their food, and even tending to their cattle. Although these troubling details quickly came to light, the police were never able to capture or even identify the perpetrator or perpetrators, and that remains the case over 100 years later. It was determined that the perpetrator's motive was likely personal, given that money was left behind, and, as I mentioned, they remained on the farm for several days after the murders. Caring for the livestock in particular indicates an intimate knowledge of, at the very least, farm life. So obviously the neighbours would be suspects. One such neighbour was the aforementioned Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a man who had a relationship with the widowed daughter Victoria and was believed by some to be the father of her youngest child, Joseph. He, of course, also was one of the 3 men to initially discover the bodies. Schlittenbauer's actions after discovering said bodies were highly suspicious, not least of which going into the house alone with the key that the family had reported missing. Some believed he may have been fueled by a grudge against the family, particularly Andreas Gruber, after their relationship had soured. Carl Gabriel, the husband that I mentioned Victoria had supposedly lost during the First World War. Rumours persisted that he survived and returned, angered by his wife's incestuous relationship with her father Andreas and her child with another man. However, the army later confirmed his death and the theory was largely dismissed. There were 2 sets of brothers who were also among chief suspects, at least at the time. First, there were the Gump brothers. Adolf and Anton Gump became suspects in the 1950s after their sister had made a deathbed confession that they had committed the murders. Adolf had a violent history as a member of the Freikorps Oberland, a voluntary parliamentary organization that, in the early years of the Weimar Republic, fought against communist and Polish insurgents. Although his brother Anton was at one stage detained, he was eventually released due to a lack of evidence. And then there were the Bickler brothers. Anton and Karl Bickler were former farmhands who reportedly, like many others, disliked Andreas Gruber. According to a former maid, Anton had in fact once said the family ought to be dead. One of the brothers, possibly Karl, was also believed to have spoken to the maid through her window about the family shortly before the murders occurred. Some have even suggested that the family patriarch, Andreas Gruber himself, was a killer in a murder-suicide. He was, after all, known for his abusive and oftentimes dictatorial behaviour, and had a documented history of violence. Proponents of this theory believe that after murdering his family, Andreas took his own life with a gun, and his death was misinterpreted by the initial, highly flawed police investigation.
Evidence had been found indicating that someone had been living in the attic. This, combined with the mysterious footprints in the snow leading to the farm but not away, fueled speculation that a drifter was the killer. In 2007, German police academy students reopened the case with the use of modern techniques. They all concluded that there was one primary suspect, but declined to release a name out of respect for his living descendant. Many have gone on to speculate that the suspect was Lawrence Schlittenbauer. A handful of other former farm workers and locals were investigated, including the Thaler brothers and a man called Peter Weber, but no charges were ever filed. A big reason why the case has sadly been so complicated is the fact that the original 1922 investigation was very heavily compromised by onlookers inexplicably trampling the crime scene, which, frustratingly, led to mishandled evidence and inconclusive results. So, in conclusion, I'm afraid there is no conclusion. The Hinterkaifeck story remains an unsolved mystery after more than a century. Despite multiple investigations and over 100 suspects, no one was ever charged or convicted of the crime. The farm where the murders occurred was demolished in 1923, erasing the crime scene and leaving behind an enduring enigma of an entire family that faced a most heinous end and whose search for justice could very likely last till the end of time.